Okay, guys. Hey, today we're going to talk about On Liberty by John Stuart Mill. Some background. We know a little bit about Mill, right? He was this 19th century British philosopher who did a lot of work with ethics and political philosophy. And earlier in the semester, we talked about certain ideas from utilitarianism. And now we're going to see how Mill tries to reconcile his ethical system with a political one. Or in other words, On Liberty is his attempt at moving utilitarianism into political territory. And so that's why the opening question is this: what political system would result in the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people? Because that's what Mill's trying to do, right? That's what the right thing is. It's the action that works in accordance with that greatest happiness principle, which of course takes into account not only the quantity of pleasure, but the quality of pleasure. So to use simpler or fewer terms, let's say not simpler, we would say what political system is the most utilitarian? And you may have some ideas about this. Mill has a very specific idea about this. So let's start. On page 1 of On Liberty, he says, "The subject of this essay is not the so-called liberty of the will, so unfortunately opposed to the misnamed doctrine of philosophical necessity, but civil or social liberty, the nature and limits of the power which can be legitimately exercised by society over the individual." Okay, so when he says he's not talking about liberty of the will, he means although he's talking about freedom, he's not talking about free will, right? Not freedom of the will, but rather political freedom, or as he calls it here, social liberty, civil liberty, right? It's not about the extent to which you have control over your decision making, which of course is a question concerning free will, but rather it's a question about how much power should a state have? And that's the question we've been discussing this whole second unit so far. And Mill's going to have something interesting to say. You may see some overlap with Locke. However, you are going to see some important differences. So here's a longer passage. I will read it as a whole, and then we'll break it down into smaller pieces. He says, a democratic republic, well, back up for a second. The reason he's saying this is because in a previous passage, he's talking about in an older time, when we were dealing with governmental issues, it was more about these straight up authoritative regimes, right? These really powerful despots. But then we move towards this thing called democracy. And so democracy becomes the central question in modern times. Let's see what he has to say about this. He says, a democratic republic came to occupy a large portion of the Earth's surface and made itself felt as one of the most powerful members of the community of nations, and elective and responsible government became subject to the observations and criticisms which weighed upon a great existing fact. It was now perceived that such phrases as self-government and the power of the people over themselves do not express the true state of the case. The people who exercise the power are not always the same people who those over whom it is exercised. And the self-government spoken of is not the government of each by himself, but of each by all the rest. The will of the people, moreover, practically means the will of the most numerous, or the most active part of the people, the majority, or those who succeed in making themselves accepted as the majority. The people, consequently, may desire to oppress a part of their number, and precautions are as much needed against this as against any other abuse of power. The limitation, therefore, of the power of government over individuals loses none of its importance when the holders of the power are regularly accountable to the community, that is, to the strongest party therein. The tyranny of the majority is now generally included among the evils against which society requires to be on its guard. Okay, So he's talking about representative democracies now, right? Voting for people to represent us, voting for people to vote about things, right? Because we don't live in a pure democracy, it is a democratic republic. And so what Mill is saying is that democracy is a weird thing because at first glance, it looks really good and really fair and really efficient because it's like, hey, we don't want this top-down authoritative structure, so in order to decentralize the power, we allow everyone a say, right? We allow everyone to vote, and this is how we're going to govern things. I mean, this is certainly how Locke thought we should govern things, right? He thought this is how civil societies are run. And so when we talk about democracy, you hear these phrases like self-government, like we the people, like self-governance, right? The power of the people over themselves. But Mill's point is that's not the case. Just because a democracy is present, this doesn't mean it's self-governance. This doesn't mean that people are governing over themselves. Because he says sometimes the people who exercise the power aren't the same people having to follow these orders that they give, and the opposite is true. So in other words, when you have a democracy, it's not everyone making decisions for everyone. It's not myself making decisions for myself. Instead, what it is some group of people making decisions for another group of people, and there's a little bit of overlap between those groups. Right? So you still wind up with this weird kind of division of power where some people wind up making decisions for other people, right? Even think of the concept of democracy. It means you have a majority and a minority. And what that means is the minority loses. And the minority could be really big. It could be 49%. And so you could wind up in these weird situations where you've, on the one hand, respected the will of the majority, which is what Locke said we should do, but that might result in like 51% of the people enslaving the other 49%. And that doesn't seem to be good. And this is why he thinks we should take seriously this idea of the tyranny of the majority, right? That's not what we want. That's not what a democracy should be. So we need to reformulate democracy if we're going to produce the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people. And by the way, this is already a very interesting point because a lot of the times when students learn about utilitarianism, they automatically think that, oh, it's about the majority, right? It's like whatever the majority says. Therefore, democracy is inherently utilitarian. But that's not the case. Because there are two reasons why that's not the case. Reason number one, as we've already discussed in class, utility for Mill means the greatest amount of happiness, which of course he defined as pleasure, right? And there's different kinds of pleasure, for the greatest number. That's not always a majority. Sometimes the utilitarian decision is a greater number that's still not a majority, right? As we said, if I have two options and I could save 2 out of 10 people or 3 out of 10 people, making the choice to save 3 people is still the utilitarian choice, even though it's not a majority of the people, right? So it's not the most necessarily, it's just the most possible. And the second reason is you may have a democracy where a bunch of people decide that they want to do something. And so on the surface you say, okay, so the majority of people are happy, therefore it's good. Well, no. What if the pain they cause the minority outweighs the pleasure that the majority enjoy? Then you have a more interesting utilitarian calculus, so to speak. Or similarly, what if the amount of higher pleasures could be increased if they didn't impose their will on the minority, and therefore the net amount of pleasure increased? So it's not black and white, although it seems like it is. It's certainly not. There's a lot more to take into consideration. So to continue on page 2, he says, protection, therefore, against the tyranny of the magistrate, so like the king, is not enough. There needs protection also against the tyranny of the prevailing opinion and feeling, against the tendency of society to impose, by other means than civil penalties its own ideas and practices as rules of conduct on those who dissent from them. There is a limit to the legitimate interference of collective opinion with individual independence. And to find that limit and maintain it against encroachment is as indispensable to a good condition of human affairs as protection against political despotism. So we need this protection from the tyranny of the majority. What Mill is saying is it's not okay for some people to impose their will onto people who don't agree or who don't consent. So it's not right when a king does it, it's not right when a ruling class does it, and it's not right when a majority of people does it, right? Just because most people want something to happen doesn't give them the right to encroach on other people's rights. That's why utility and democracy aren't synonyms. So in other words, let's say you get a bunch of people, like 51% of people, they say, you know what, I think that drinking alcohol is immoral. Therefore, you shouldn't be allowed to drink alcohol. Let's say 49% of people don't agree with that. Does that therefore mean that the 51% of people get to impose and enforce their own idea of morality on other people? Is it okay to take my opinion and add a gun to it and turn it into a law that I could punish people with if they don't agree with me? Because democracy could result in that, right? And so he says there's a limit. There is a limit to how much the collective can do to the individual. It is not a free-for-all. It is not a purely collectivist thing. There's only so much that a majority can rightfully do to a minority. And we need to find this limit, right? That's Mill's point. And so that's the question. That's the question to think about, right? How can we balance all of this? Like, how can we have something like a democracy, but then also limit that democracy so that it doesn't produce unjust results? What constraints or what principles can we inject into democracy that would make it more utilitarian, right? That would prevent it from stomping over the rights of the individual or of the minority? It's a very complex question. And he gives us an answer. On page 2, he says, the object of this essay is to assert one very simple principle, and that principle is that the sole end for which mankind are warranted individually or collectively in interfering with the liberty of action of any of their number is self-protection. That the only purpose for which power can rightfully be exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant. He cannot rightfully be compelled to do so or forbear, because for him it will be better to do so, or because it will make him happier, or because in the opinions of others to do so would be wise or even right. So this is the one staple in Mill's political philosophy, right? He says the only way that society can interfere rightfully in the affairs of another person or a group of people is if not doing that would result in harm. In other words, people should be allowed to do whatever they want unless they are going to harm other people. So you might have heard this phrase, something like, your freedom to swing your fist ends where someone's nose begin. And that comes from Mill, right? That's the idea. And he's specifically talking about physical harm or the threat of physical harm. Because he talks about in other parts of liberty, like freedom of opinion is good, but it's not unlimited, because I can't come outside your house with like pitchforks and threaten to harm you. Like that's still a form of harm, right? Because it's a threat of physical harm. So if there's no harm physically and no threat of physical harm, then it should be allowed. You can't, according to Mill, use someone's own good, whether it's physical or moral, as a reason. So in other words, some people think that, let's say, a bad drug like heroin, right? They'll say this should be illegal. And then you say, why should heroin be illegal? You might reason, well, because when people do heroin, they harm themselves. And Mill wants to say that's not a good reason, right? There's this whole idea that a lot of us have that we should, quote unquote, protect people from themselves. So we ban drugs, we ban prostitution, we make people wear seatbelts, we ban soda in vending machines, right? All of these laws are intended to save people from themselves. And Mill thinks they're unjust. Because if people want to engage in behavior, even if we admit it's bad behavior, they should be able to do that, right? Because they're not harming anyone other than themselves. And so there's a name he gives to these laws that encroach on liberties for the sake of saving us from ourselves. It's called paternalistic laws. Paternal as in fatherly, parental. So if you want to do some research on paternalistic laws, I think that'll help here. Mill is very much against paternalism. And the overarching term we use to describe Mill's position is called the harm principle. Right? The harm principle is just this idea that you shouldn't be able to regulate behavior or limit someone's freedom unless there is some kind of physical harm that's going to happen or a threat of physical harm. But there's a little bit more to it. And what I mean by that is there's different ways of explaining this idea, and the different ways of explaining could reveal like little subtle details that were left out in what we've said so far. And one idea that's very, very interesting is that when Mill talks about rights, he doesn't mean a right in the same way that Locke talks about rights. And you get that in this passage, right? He says, "It is proper to state that I forgo any advantage which could be derived to my argument from the idea of abstract right as a thing independent of utility. I regard utility as the ultimate appeal on all ethical questions, but it must be utility in the largest sense, grounded on the permanent interests of a man as a progressive being." So think about what he's saying. I forgo any advantage which could be derived to my argument from the idea of an abstract right. He's taking a jab at Locke here, and other people like Locke. Because remember, Locke believed in natural rights. Remember, a natural right is this thing that just kind of exists in reality. It's just you're born with these natural rights not to be infringed upon. These are like real things out in the world. Mill doesn't think so. He thinks that these are abstract, right? Rights are something we make up. It doesn't mean they're bad. It just means we can't appeal to them as these like innate properties that exist in reality. So we should behave as if we had these kind of rights. We should take them seriously, but we want to recognize that the importance of rights is not that they're innate features, but that they produce the most utility. So while Mill winds up believing in negative rights or freedom from constraints in the same way that Locke did, his justification for the rights is different. Locke justifies negative freedom by appealing to natural rights, and Mill justifies negative freedom by appealing to utility, right? Constructed rights that promote the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people. But to continue on the harm principle, he talks about it in terms of interests and responsibility and how like different groups have different interests and how far-reaching these interests should be. He says on page 4, to individuality should belong the part of life in which it is chiefly the individual that is interested, to society the part which chiefly interests society. The acts of an individual may be hurtful to others or wanting in due consideration for their welfare without going to the length of violating any of their constituted rights. The offender may then be justly punished by opinion, though not by law, as soon as any part of a person's conduct affects prejudicially the interests of others, society has jurisdiction over it. And the question whether the general welfare will or will not be promoted by interfering with it becomes open to discussion. But there is no room for entertaining any such question when a person's conduct affects the interests of no persons besides himself. In all such cases, there should be perfect freedom, legal and social, to do the action and stand the consequences. Okay, so to individuality should belong the part of life which it is chiefly the individual that is interested. So people, regular individuals, they should be concerned with things that affect them, right? They should be concerned with themselves and the people close to them and the people being affected by their decisions. But society only should have jurisdiction over the actions that individuals take that affect society, right? So if an individual is taking an action that only affects that individual and which doesn't harm anyone else, which doesn't harm society, then society does not have the right to interfere with that individual's behavior. And it doesn't matter. The individual could be doing something that's objectively bad. Like, you shouldn't overeat unhealthy foods all the time. You shouldn't do heroin. You shouldn't do these things that are going to be harmful to you, right? But that doesn't mean people have a right to interfere with your freedom to do those things. Instead, people should be punished by opinion, not law. And this was the discussion post I had you guys think about. Like, what does that mean to be punished by opinion but not by law? Because we know being punished by law means you face some kind of penalty that imposes upon your freedom. For example, you do something and then now you pay a fine, right? So the government is taking the fruits of your labor. The government is taking property, and that's a kind of legal punishment. Or maybe what they do is they say, now you can no longer do this thing. Like, you lose your license to do something. You can no longer associate with these people or go to this place. Or even maybe you're going to be put in jail, right? Let's take you from your home and put you in this containment facility. All those are legal punishments. And there are good reasons, according to Mill, why we would do that. And the good reason is that you're harming others, right? Or trying to harm others. But that's not the only way of punishing someone. You could punish someone by opinion. And the concept of reputation really winds up being important here. Because think about how there are people that you know that you don't hang around, not because you're forced to not hang around, but because they did something bad, and then now everyone knows, and they have a bad reputation, and so no one hangs around them, right? Like, that's an example of that person being punished by opinion, right? People are freely choosing no longer to associate them. Or think about something like Yelp. Like, let's say a business winds up doing something unethical. Like, a restaurant has very dirty facilities or has terrible food or something. Like, we don't have the right to go in and take their freedom away. We do if they're hurting someone, but not if they're not. This is why we have review sites, right? You go on, you say, 2 stars, this thing happened that I think you should be aware of. And I guess an interesting question for us to ask would be, should there be a limit to that kind of thing? Because we could imagine some kind of reputation system going overboard, like in that one episode of Black Mirror, if you haven't seen, where the world is just based on interacting and then rating your social interactions 1 through 5. And that can get dystopian real quick. If you haven't checked that out, I highly recommend it. But Mill is saying it's okay to have an opinion of someone and for someone to suffer opinion-based consequences for their action. So like, if I do something stupid and then everyone's like, oh my God, that guy's stupid, I'm not going to hang around him, that's okay, right? That's people using their freedom to make the right decision. but it wouldn't be right to punish me legally for doing something that's stupid. And again, there's no room for even entertaining the question of putting someone in jail or taking someone's freedom away just because they're hurting themselves, right? Not an excuse. Mill thinks you should have the freedom to make dumb decisions. You should have the freedom to do things that harm yourself, right? Because it produces the most happiness for the most people, right? And the highest quality if people are allowed this element of freedom, if people are given free reign over their bodies and their decision-making processes. And again, this doesn't mean there's no consequences. It just means there's no legal consequences. So these are the questions that I want to leave you guys with for today. There's, of course, more than this, but these are the ones that come to my mind. The one is Mill right? Is it true that the harm principle would produce utilitarian results, right? Would the harm principle really create the maximal happiness? I don't know. There's certainly arguments for it. Let's see if we can come up with some arguments against it. A similar question would be, we talked about having to constrain democracy. Is the harm principle that right constraint, right? Because think about how they relate. In a pure democracy, if you don't like what someone's doing, and let's say, I don't know, something crazy, like they're wearing a color you don't like, right? Pick any kind of ridiculous example. In a pure democracy, in theory, you get 51% of people to say, hey, you shouldn't be allowed to wear that color. And then the minority disagrees but gets their rights taken away. Like, yep, you can't wear that color because we've decided it. Mill says the way to constrain democracy is to say, hey, the democracy is good, but the democracy cannot, even if they have majority support, take certain rights from individuals. Is this the correct way to constrain democracy? Or should democracy even have a constraint? Right? Some things to think of. Here's another question. Mill's idea is called the harm principle, but it only includes physical harm. Maybe that's right. Maybe it's not. Should harm be broadened to include non-physical harm, like psychological harm or something like that? And another question you might want to consider is, who has the better of the argument when it comes to rights? Is it Locke or Mill? Are rights really natural? Right? Are they just already there as innate realities that exist? Or are rights not natural and instead just these constructs that we make because they produce good results? So there's a bunch of good discussion questions here to get your wheels turning in your head, a bunch of good research questions here. Start thinking about topics, of course, for paper 2, which we'll talk about in the coming weeks. And you have a lot of fodder so far when it comes to topics. They all pertain to social political questions, as we've said. But yeah, I think that's pretty good for today. As always, you can reach out if you have any questions. And we'll stop there for today, guys. All right? See you around.